Hi everyone, Jason here of spiritualbabies.net. You've joined us for the second chapter of the book of Jonah. Leading us through this, my friend Rabbi Joshua Neely out there in Florida. Thank you for giving us your time again.
Always glad.
And we are going to jump straight in. We won't dig too much into the first 2 or 3 lines of this, although there is lots to unravel. I will ask you a few difficult questions about this, just based on other commentaries I've read. Line 1, and the Lord appointed a huge fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish. So I'm going to stop there for a moment, because I know that there are commentaries which mention a few interesting things about the fish. First, obviously, popular culture, when you see this ever kind of drawn out in an illustration, the fish is usually called a whale.
Right. But people love this for art, yes.
Yeah. I think it might be because whales are very easy to draw. Compared to like a leviathan or some other big, low swimming, like a whale shark or something. Whales are nice and easy. It's a rectangle with a tail on. But the commentaries often state that there were 2 whales in this equation.
Absolutely, and that has to do with a little bit of a grammatical hiccup that seems to happen between verse 1 and verse, sorry, let's make sure I've got the right one here. Verse 2, right. So what happens is, in verse 1, the word for fish, dag, is the masculine form. And in verse 2, the word for fish is daga, which is the feminine form. And so the commentators have to explain, how did we go from a masculine fish to a feminine fish? And the solution the commentators have come up with is the masculine fish transferred Jonah to the feminine fish.
Is this the only time in the text of the Bible where something like that happens?
It's the only one I know of that is this stark, where you have it as one gender in one line, and then immediately in the next line a different gender. It may sound wrong in the modern context to say that gender is a bit more fluid than people are used to.
Right.
That means something different now than it used to.
Yeah.
But in terms of the laws of grammar, there are many cases where a word of one gender might be used in a different style or in a different form in different contexts. It's unusual to have it be back to back in verse to verse, but not unusual for it to change over the entire body of the Bible. So it doesn't particularly bother me or force me to bang my head of what in the world is happening here. But I can absolutely see what the impetus was for those commentaries.
Ultimately, I suppose it doesn't really change anything about the story. The synopsis of the story doesn't really change. It's just an interesting grammatical hiccup, which has had some long conversations made about it.
Which, hopefully those conversations are fruitful and productive of why it would be in that particular way. One thing I should also point out is that a lot of people really get their fingers wrapped up in their hair about whether it was a fish or whether it was a whale, and what does the word dag mean. And quite frankly, I don't know. That is to say, the biblical usage of the word dag is not decided by what the modern usage of the word dag is in modern Hebrew. And we see some variety of usage for this word and other words, meaning for sea creatures, throughout the ancient world and the Middle Ages. So linguistically, it is really quite pointless, and it's even worse than being pedantic to argue that it must be translated as fish or that it needs to be translated as whale. It is clearly a sea creature. That is what is important. Now, one way to try and settle the argument, which is going to open up a whole other can of worms, pardon the fishing reference, is that dag may very likely be indicating a fish in this particular case, because the fish was the symbol of the city of Nineveh.
Right.
Which I think is going to come back as a very important understanding of what's going on in this whole chapter. But we'll probably leave that non-literal discussion until after we've gone through the full chapter.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that it was one of the deities in the area. But yeah, we'll get there.
Exactly, and we've found on archaeological sites inscriptions using the fish as a symbol of that city. So it is fairly well linked to Nineveh as a place. Like I said, I think we should definitely discuss that before we leave chapter 2.
Okay.
Because I think it's rather critical to understanding what's going on here.
And he said, I called out from my distress to the Lord, and he answered me. From the belly of the grave I cried out. You heard my voice. And you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and a river surrounded me. All your breakers and your waves passed over me. So when I read this, I was kind of shocked because it almost sounds like he's blaming God for ending up in the water. Jonah made the choice there. But yeah, he says, you cast me into the deep.
And that's actually the exact point. So we have to understand, or we have to try and understand, when exactly is Jonah praying, and why is he praying now rather than praying on deck when the sailors were asking him, pray to your God? And that is what should strike any reader of this book. Is chapter 1, Jonah was a mountain of pig-headedness. He did not want to go to Nineveh. He didn't want to ask God for forgiveness. He preferred to die than to yield his position. And now all of a sudden in chapter 2, by three lines in, he is opening himself up to God. Now, the question is, did this take 3 days and 3 nights before he actually started praying? Or did the prayer come at other times? I'm personally of the opinion that it probably came in at least to the middle, if not to the end, for reasons that are connected to the city of Nineveh. But what's important to recognize is that what he has done here is a 180-degree shape. As we talked about in the first chapter, Jonah's character is all wrapped up in this notion of justice, right? You do something wrong, you get the punishment God has set aside for you, and you shouldn't get a warning. This is what it is, right? It's you know what the laws are. When the cop pulls you over because you were speeding, don't expect a warning, expect a ticket. And Jonah's willing to take the ticket himself. Somehow his experience in the fish has changed that mentality. Somehow his experience in the fish has made him realize that people in dire circumstances deserve compassion, that they deserve to be heard by God. And he has had to go through that similar experience before he is willing to have that empathy and compassion for others that have gone through similar or worse circumstances. And that's the transformation. So that's why he's now calling out to God, is because he has had this moment of revelation that God is about compassion more than God is about justice. Justice is absolutely there. It's part of the fabric of the universe, but compassion is the primary channel that we are supposed to use to reach towards God. And he is finally getting that, and now he's using it. But it took this terrible circumstance for him to truly have it. And the metaphor here is one that is so beautiful, not just to describe the literal experience of being thrown into the ocean and what is it like to drown. And if anybody's ever had trouble swimming, what he is saying here is so very, very true of what it feels like to be struggling to keep your head above water and to feel yourself slipping further and further under. But that's also the perfect metaphor for somebody who is trapped in sin, in transgression, that they may be struggling to do the right thing, but it just feels like they are being pulled further and further and further into desperate circumstances. If you've ever talked to somebody who's dealt with addiction, if you've ever talked to somebody who has worked to try and escape bad neighborhoods and communities, it just fits exactly the experience that people have.
So in line 4, and you cast me into the deep, it's less about him trying to put the blame and more on him saying, this is how you tried to solve the problem I had that I didn't know about.
Exactly. Right. This was your attempt to give me a lesson. Right. And I'm recognizing it not as punishment per se, but as instructional. It's just sort of like, the parent who gives the child a task that they know is going to be hard and difficult for the kid in order to teach them a lesson. Maybe teaching them a lesson in the sense that when they fail, they learn that they need help or that they need to ask for help, or it may be a lesson that they are more capable than they thought. In this particular case, the lesson is that Jonah needs to ask for help and realize that help is being offered in order for him to take the message to Nineveh that help is being offered if they will only ask. And so God is putting him in that position so that he'll learn that lesson.
Okay. 5. And I said, I have been driven away from before your eyes. Indeed, I will continue to gaze upon your holy temple. I better stop there. How?
Well, first of all, I guess I should point out, because translation is always fun, you can read the second half about gazing upon the holy temple not as a I will, but will I? So it can be, it's ambivalent, depending upon translation, right? I was driven from your sight. Would I ever see your temple again? That is a perfectly valid way to read line 5.
So you could you could swap those I will for a will I, and it would make sense.
Exactly, yes, especially in context. So it could be the feeling that, I have no means to come back to you because that's what the temple was. And I've been driven away from you, meaning I no longer have my feeling of intimacy with you. What am I going to do? And now he's finally beginning to realize what it feels like to be in that circumstance, to feel like you have no connection to God, to feel like you can't ever go to the temple or ever have this physical way of approaching God. How incredibly depressing and debilitating would that feeling be? This is something Jonah's never experienced. He grew up as somebody who was familiar with God, familiar with Judaism, familiar with the temple, and he never realized what an incredible luxury that is. And what a boon that is. And the people of Nineveh, they've never had that. And imagine how desperate you feel if you really feel you're all alone in life, if you really feel like there is nothing for you, that there are these impersonal forces that are buffeting you like the waves of a sea, and you have nothing to say or do, you have no connection, no feeling of connection, no way to reconcile. That is a horrible feeling of helplessness. And Jonah is now experiencing that for the first time in his life. The people of Nineveh have been experiencing it their entire life.
Water has surrounded me even to the soul. The deep encompassed me. The Red Sea hangs over my head. I can't let that go. Because it's my understanding he went from Jaffa towards the Mediterranean, north into the Mediterranean. So Red Sea mustn't mean the Sea of Reeds. It must mean something else.
Okay, so the reason, of course, the commentators use the term Red Sea here is, well, the reason, of course, that the translator for the commentary uses the term Red Sea here, it goes back to the idea of what was the Yam Suf, which was the name of the body of water that the Israelites crossed when they left Egypt. And the word Suf is used here as well. Not Yam Suf, but just Suf. And Suf means the reeds. And so before we get to the commentary level, on the sort of surface level, the poetry here is saying, I felt like I was being wrapped up all the way up to my head in the reeds under the water. And I don't know if you've ever swum anywhere where there are underwater weeds, seaweed or underwater grass. It is incredibly creepy and just absolutely terrifying. I had the experience once. We were on a little sailboat. We were up near the shore, and I needed to get out to adjust where the boat was, and the water was much, much deeper than I thought it was. And I jumped over the edge thinking I would just land on sand. And instead, I sunk in below my head under the water and down into these weeds that immediately feel like they're coiling around your legs. I mean, it's just exactly how it felt. So on a surface level, that's what the poetry seems to be describing. From the commentary level, the idea of hearkening back this to Yam Suf is a very powerful reminder of the notion of what was it like for the sea to close over? What is the feeling of that opening of redemption now being closed in front of you? And so it's a very powerful thematic link to go from Suf to Yam Suf.
To the bottoms of the mountains I descended. The earth, its bars are closed on me forever. but you brought up my life from Gehenna, O Lord my God. I'm going to skip right to the Gehenna bit. We have an idea in the Western world that Gehenna means hell.
Right. So first of all, which translation are you reading from?
Because they're on Chabad.org.
Okay, so they are clearly doing some preemptive translating.
Okay.
Which is to say, the word Gehenna is not found in this verse.
Oh wow! Oh, I love that. I love it when they do that. All right. Okay.
That's not to say that it's not referring to a Gehenna-like concept.
Can we just so Gehenna often is used as a representation of kind of a fiery hell, but it was actually a physical place where people burnt the trash.
And did lots of other horrible things.
Yeah, sure. It was the pagan sacrifices and all sorts of things historically.
Right.
There. Yeah.
So it became a byword for nasty place. And it's used metaphorically in Jewish theology to try and instill in people an idea that there will be a comeuppance for evil in the afterlife, not permanent and forever. It's a time of punishment, not of being trapped. So we're not talking about eternal damnation here. We're talking about a punishment place. But it is still a nasty sort of concept because no one wants to be punished. And of course, the way you avoid punishment is by either avoiding the transgression in the first place or by atoning for it in this life. So in the poetry here, what Jonah is trying to reference is this feeling of being trapped in a place of punishment, of being in a place where you feel like you are going to be trapped forever, but God is lifting him up out of that. Right? The actual word here is the shachat, which is maybe better translated as just pit, like the pit kind of pit. You could also go sort of underworldish, place of spiritual imprisonment. There's nothing quite as short and pithy in English as there is as the shachat in the Hebrew.
Okay.
So, but the feeling here again is, and this is where we are turning around the poetry. I don't know if we've talked before that Hebrew often has what's known as a sort of semi-chiastic or chiastic, sometimes really, or semi-chiastic structure, where the main point or the transition point is often the middle of a chapter or middle of a thought.
Okay.
And then it sort of transitions at that point into a different style or theme.
I think we found that when we went through Hosea. There's definitely a half. There's a measure where you get so far, and then the whole message changes, and it's much more
exactly. So think of it like a mirror, right? So you come in and then you go out, and it's not a perfect in terms of number of verses in this particular case, but in terms of thematic chiastic structure, we have that of I am depressed, I am trapped, I am dying, and then in verse 7 we begin the process of reversing that, where now I am turning around, and even though I was at the bottom, now I am being lifted up. And who's lifting me up? It's God. Right? So I was without God, and I felt trapped. Now I'm being lifted up because I'm with God. And then we're going to see verse 8 is a parallel to verse 5, for example. And then he draws his moral lessons in 9 and 10.
When my soul grew faint upon me, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you, to your holy temple. It's actually it's interesting for me. I mean, reading through other books, and we've had 2 references here in as many lines where he's mentioned the holy temple. It's not really the center of, you don't read about the holy temple that much outside of the building of it and the use of it. For a person that's far away, it doesn't come up so much in the prophets, especially. It's an interesting thing, but it reminds me in was it 1 Kings 8 where you've got the Solomon's pledge, and he says, pray towards the temple. I mean, it would be for any religious person, it would be the direction you needed to go. It'd always be in front of you. Right,
which is echoed all the way through to the time of Daniel, who still has that same practice. And we can see from the rebuilding of the Second Temple that the people were grief-stricken that it wasn't of the same glory as the first. that the temple really did have a very powerful emotional hold on the entire nation. So they didn't constantly walk around saying, I'm thinking of the temple, I'm thinking of the temple, I'm thinking of the temple. But clearly, the average person had a deep personal feeling of connection to the temple. And someone like Jonah, who's a prophet, all the more so.
Those who keep worthless futilities abandon their kindness, but I, with a voice of thanks, will I sacrifice to you what I vowed I will pay for the salvation of the Lord. I'm going to read that again. But I, with a voice of thanks, will I sacrifice to you what I vowed I will pay for the salvation of the Lord. Now, what did he vow, and what will he pay?
Right. So the idea of a vow here, this is finishing off the temple metaphor. The idea is that at some point in his desperation, he would have made a vow saying, if I get out of this alive, I will bring an offering to the temple.
The bolt hell vow. It's the same for everybody across the world, regardless of whether they have any faith or not. When you think everything is meeting its end, you always make that promise.
Right. And one of the things that's very interesting is that he feels at this point in line 10, he feels that his prayer has already been answered. And that's why he is confirming that he is indeed going to pay, make good on the vow that he made.
Which is why you think that this prayer happened at the end of his incarceration in the belly.
Exactly right. And in fact, the entire prayer fits better after verse 11, after he has been spewed out by the fish. Well, actually read verse 11, and then I'll give you a different way to read this whole chapter.
Okay, great. And the Lord said to the fish, and it spewed Jonah onto the dry land. And that is the end of chapter 2. All
right. So if you will bear with me for a moment, imagine if we were to read from 1 and 2, and then jump to 3. Then jump to 11 as our third verse. So you have Jonah going into the waves, and you have this fish somehow rescuing him, and that he's praying as he is holding onto this fish as it's taking him to the shore for 3 days. And then he is up on the shore after those 3 days. Make sense?
Well.
And then as he gets up on the shore, he offers this prayer. Right? So imagine him sitting on the beach in his clothes that have been drenched now for 3 days of traveling via fish, and he's finally getting it. Right? He's finally understanding that what it's like to go through this moment of despair and to feel like there's no hope, and to when you're actually faced with your own death, you may not be quite so cavalier about it. And sure, maybe on the boards, the planking of the ship, he could be brave, and I will take my punishment like a man because I've deserved, because I ran away from God. Yeah. But as soon as the water starts going over his head, all of a sudden it's like, no, I don't want to die. God, please help me. And that's not to embarrass or to humiliate him. I mean, that is the message God wanted him to finally understand.
It's a very human thing to feel invulnerable, and when you're on a boat, you can afford to be brave. You don't feel like your life is at risk.
Right. And even thrown over the side, that's just jumping over the side. You're not going to die just from hitting the water. But as the water begins to take you, as you begin to feel yourself going, all of a sudden you realize how precious life is, and all of a sudden you realize that you probably made the wrong choice. And wouldn't it be nice if there was a reset button? Wouldn't it be nice if there was a way to fix this rather than dying? And that is exactly what God wants to tell the people of Nineveh, that they can hit a reset button, that they can fix what they've been doing. They're not destined to go down into flames. They can actually repair it. And Jonah had to experience it for themselves, and he had to feel this miraculous recovery, that he was carried by a fish, not as punishment, but as a miracle to bring him to the shore. I mean, I imagine him, clinging to the side of a dolphin as it takes him up to the water, to the shore. Dolphins being plentiful in the Mediterranean back then, and him sort of having this moment of realization as he blinks back the salt water from his eyes, as he's gasping and lying there in the wet sand, of, I get it. I understand now what it's like to feel that way. So that is one way to read all of chapter 2 that doesn't involve bizarre anatomy for the fish, and still makes the entire message perfectly clear and why it is such an appropriate experience for Jonah to have before we get to chapter 3.
We mentioned,
and then I'm going to offer, if you didn't like that, I'm going to offer an even more non-literal interpretation of chapter 2. But let's discuss this.
So we mentioned briefly that the fish would have been recognized deity. Or, I mean, I know that later on in Roman culture and in Greek culture, dolphins were heavily used in iconography. I think there's a famous Roman story about a boy and a dolphin that you'll even find in some storybooks today. Would it be fair to say that it's conceivable that the whale is part of this story? So when he spoke to the people in Nineveh, they would see this as a divine. I mean, he's going to roll up and say, "You never believe what just happened to me." A big fish.
It's interesting. I've never thought of that as this being giving him a cultural touchstone that makes his story more palatable, believable to the people of Nineveh. I hadn't thought of it in that particular way. It's certainly possible. But go ahead.
I was just going to ask. So, what do we know about Nineveh and its religious alignment, and why would the fish have been a big deal?
I don't know much more than that. I just know from the inscriptions and archaeology that it was connected with them. I don't know their full pantheon and style of worship.
That's right.
But let's go down that road of the fish as being a symbol of Nineveh, the city, and take this into like I said, even more non-literal understanding of chapter 2, because I think most of us find the whole fish story a little unsettling from a literal point of view. But the message still remains the same. And we can salvage the fish if we like, with the sort of being rescued by a dolphin or other sort of whales that used to live in the Mediterranean. But there's another way to read this, and it's to go with this usage of the phrase that he was trapped in the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. What else do we know that is 3 days long? The city of Nineveh.
Oh, really?
Yep. That's what we're going to find in the very beginning of chapter 3. That this is a big city, and it's actually in the 3rd verse, and that it is a 3-day walk to go across the city.
I'd never put those two things together.
And so one way to read this, of being trapped in the fish for 3 days, is after he is washed ashore. We still have the whole scene in the boat. We still have him being washed ashore, and he's beginning to realize that he was saved and that he didn't deserve to be saved. And that's beginning to change how he looks at what God does and God's compassion and God's justice. And he stumbles into the city of Nineveh, and he walks from one end to the other. And he is now living in their city. He is trapped in their city for 3 days, so to speak. He is in the belly of the beast. And he sees the world from their point of view. He sees what that darkness looks like. He sees what it's like, how easy it is to be a person who does horrible things when you're trapped inside a place like Nineveh at this time, and how hopeless they feel, right? They know, he probably, when he talks to them, he can tell that they know that what they're doing is wrong, but they can't seem to escape it. They don't believe there's any better option. They don't believe that there is a way out of this. And certainly if they believe in some supreme being that transcends their basic, pantheon of nasty characters, they probably don't think that supreme being really cares about them. And that finally gives him the understanding of people who are doing things that it's not beyond their control, but they feel that it is beyond their control, and how they need to be rescued. And so, having walked through this whale of a city for 3 days, he now can give them a true message of hope, a true message of redemption, which they leap on. But we'll leave that for our discussion of chapter 3.
Honestly, my mind has been... I love that. That's awesome. That's really great. I mean, I like the poetry of it and this symbology. Because I can't believe I haven't come across that before. It's awesome. And, it's difficult as well, because my mind starts saying, well, was the whale thing important? Did they both happen? Is this two ways of telling somebody? I mean, one of the things they tell teachers is that no two kids are going to understand the same information in the same way. So it's just a way of telling the story twice. But that doesn't matter, I don't think. I think what matters is...
Well, I mean, those are interesting questions and good points for discussion, commentary, and scholarship. But the answers to those questions don't take away from the overall story.
Yeah. Excellent. All right. So that was chapter 2 of Jonah. We'll be back with chapter 3 shortly. So I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you very much, Rabbi Neely, for giving us your time and your knowledge again. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Jason.
And we'll see you guys very soon. If you want to see more of Rabbi Neely's videos, there's a link on your screen right now. You can go to his channel, and there's a playlist underneath it, so you can see everything that we've done together over the many years. Wow.
It has been quite a few years now.
It really has. So don't forget to go over there and subscribe. He puts out 2 or 3 shows a week, and then on Mishnah and on the Torah portions and other things, well worth your time. Thank you very much, and we'll see you all again very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.